The air was thick with dust and smoke, the crackling of distant fires punctuating the thunderous explosions. Lara Quinn stood at the edge of the colony's outer perimeter, her eyes scanning the horizon. Through the haze, she could make out the silhouette of the Xylan warships, their massive forms darkening the sky. The invasion had begun. "Commander, they're coming in fast," said Colonel Harris, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a trace of concern. He handed Lara a datapad, displaying the current tactical map. "We can't hold them much longer." Lara didn't need to look at the screen. She already knew the odds. The Xylans had been relentless, sweeping through the outer colonies one by one, each attack more brutal than the last. Arden 4, with its mining resources and strategic location, had always been a target. But today, the resistance wasn't ready for a full-scale assault of this magnitude. "We hold," Lara said, her voice unwavering. "We fight until the last man. No retreat." Colonel Harris nodded, his expression grim. He had known Lara for years, but even he could see the change in her. The once pragmatic, calm leader was now a woman driven by something darker, a need for vengeance that was starting to consume her. The death of her daughter in the Xylan's earlier raids had been a turning point. Lara turned back to the team, rallying her forces with a brief but fiery speech. "This is our home. We fight for our people. We fight for what remains. Do not let them take it. Fight until they're on their knees." The fighters scattered, taking their positions. Lara's thoughts were sharp, focused. In the past, she had been able to hold on to her hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Now, that hope was slipping away, replaced by a cold rage. She grabbed her pulse rifle and motioned for Harris to follow. They moved swiftly through the wreckage of the outer barricades, the sounds of distant gunfire and shouting growing louder. "We've got a breach at Sector 7, shouted one of the scouts, running up to Lara. "They're through the main gates. We need to fall back, regroup." Lara hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing on her. But there was no time for indecision. "Hold your ground," she ordered, her voice firm. "We'll push them back." The sounds of battle intensified as the Xylan forces stormed forward, their sleek black ships hovering ominously above the colony. The resistance had fought to the last man before, but this time Lara knew they were outgunned. The Xylans were relentless, an unstoppable force of technological superiority. But that didn't matter. They had taken her family, her home, her people. And for that, Lara would make them pay. The explosion. Lara was at the front lines when the first missile hit. The ground trembled beneath her feet as a blinding flash of light illuminated the sky. She spun around instinctively, ducking low behind a nearby building for cover. "Is everyone all right?" she yelled over the chaos, scanning her surroundings. A soldier scrambled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "We're losing ground fast, Commander. They've deployed their air support." Lara didn't answer. Her eyes were already on the horizon again, the place she had last seen her daughter playing just hours ago, laughing as the sun set over the horizon. That image had always been her source of calm, a picture of a peaceful future. But now, there was nothing left of it but the memory. Another blast shook the ground, this one much closer, and Lara's heart skipped. She didn't have to look to know that the Xylans had targeted the civilian sectors. "Get to the shelter!" she screamed. "Now!" But it was too late. A massive explosion tore through the colony's residential sector, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. The sky above was filled with debris and smoke, and Lara's ears rang with the sound of the blast. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a scream. Not of the enemy, but of a soldier she had known since the beginning of this war, a soldier whose face twisted with horror as he fell to his knees. Lara's stomach churned. She didn't need to ask. She knew the truth. Her home, the one place she had always thought was safe, was gone. She started to run, but Harris grabbed her arm. "Lara, it's too dangerous." "Let me go, Harris," she snapped, her voice edged with panic. She wrenched herself free and charged through the smoke, ignoring the calls of her team. "Lila," she screamed her daughter's name over and over as she sprinted through the devastated streets. The once vibrant colony was now a charred ruin, fires raging where houses once stood, the air thick with the scent of burning metal and flesh. Lara rounded a corner and stopped in her tracks. There, amidst the ruin, was the one thing she couldn't bear to see, the shattered remains of her daughter's room. A doll, once bright and cheerful, now lay half-buried beneath the rubble. Her heart stopped. "No," she whispered, falling to her knees. The rest of the world seemed to fade away as she stared at the debris, willing it to be different, to somehow rewrite the fate that had befallen her. Tears filled her eyes, but no sound came. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from a deep, inescapable grief. And then, just as quickly as the sorrow hit, something else followed, a cold, burning rage that gripped her chest and made her pulse roar in her ears. This wasn't just loss, it was personal. They had taken everything from her, and now they would pay. The vow. Lara staggered to her feet, wiping away the tears that blurred her vision. She stood tall, her face hardening. The Xylans had underestimated humanity. They believed they could erase them, crush their spirits. But Lara Quinn would not let that happen. Not now. Not ever. She looked around, seeing the remains of her comrades, their faces twisted in exhaustion, fear, and grief. The fight wasn't over, and they needed her to lead. But now, leading was no longer just about surviving. It was about vengeance. She turned back to Harris, who had followed her silently. The look on his face was one of helplessness. "We can't win this battle, Lara. Not today." Her voice was cold, unwavering. "Then we'll win the next one. And the one after that. As long as we have breath, we will fight." Harris nodded, his expression softening slightly. He knew Lara had changed, but he also knew that she was the only one who could keep the resistance together now. "Let's get to the command center," he said, voice firm once more. "We still have a war to fight." Lara glanced at the remains of the ruined colony one last time, her heart set on one thing only: revenge. "We fight," she said, "until every last one of them is gone." With that, she turned, leading the charge against the enemy. The war had just begun, but the stakes had never been higher. The Resistance's last hope. Lara Quinn stood in the darkened room, staring at the hollow map of the galaxy projected in front of her. The red markers signaled Xylan-controlled territories, and her eyes lingered on one, more menacing than the rest: Valkyr, a desolate world at the heart of enemy space. She had no doubt that General Zorthake, the monster responsible for the death of her daughter, was there, holed up in a high-tech fortress surrounded by his elite guard. The map flickered, and Colonel Harris stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He was grim-faced, his usually stoic demeanor showing signs of strain. He handed her a datapad, the information on it barely registering as Lara's mind remained fixed on Valkyr. "Do you really think we can pull this off?" Lara Harris asked, his voice low but steady. "This mission. We're outmatched." Lara looked at him, her gaze piercing. "We don't have a choice, Harris. It's the only chance we have. If we don't stop Zorthake now, we'll never get another shot." Her words hung in the air like a promise she had made to herself. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for revenge, and that alone was propelling her forward. Harris didn't reply right away. He knew she was right. The war had dragged on too long, and humanity was on the brink of extinction. But this mission was a suicide run. Valkyr was heavily fortified, and the Xylans had advanced weaponry that made even the best resistance tactics seem futile. Still, they couldn't afford to do nothing. The small, makeshift base was bustling with activity. Resistance fighters worked feverishly, repairing gear, reloading weapons, and preparing for the mission. Lara moved among them, her heart heavy but her resolve unwavering. Every face she passed was filled with determination, but there was an underlying current of fear. They knew the risks, and they knew the stakes. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was the final push. Lara approached Mia, a former Xylan sympathizer who had defected after witnessing the horrors the Xylans were inflicting upon the human race. She had proven herself time and again in battle, and her knowledge of Xylan technology was invaluable. "Ready?" Lara asked, her voice steady but soft. Mia nodded, her dark eyes filled with something like quiet fury. "I've seen what they can do. This is personal for me too." Lara placed a hand on her shoulder, her grip firm. "We'll get him, Mia. We'll take him down." Mia didn't respond, but the unspoken promise between them was enough. There was nothing more to be said. The mission ahead would be their hardest yet, but it was a fight they couldn't back out of. Not after everything they had lost. The plan was simple, too simple, Lara thought. Their goal was to infiltrate Valkyr, locate Zorthake's command center, and disable the Xylan fleet before it could retaliate. The resistance would strike fast, hit hard, and disappear into the shadows before the Xylans could react. There was no room for error. 3 teams, Lara said as she gathered the unit together. We go in quiet. We disable their communications first, then take out their defense systems. Once we have the command center, we get Zorthake. The rest of you hold the perimeter. There were murmurs of agreement, but also doubt. Lara could see it in their eyes. The plan might seem straightforward, but the reality of facing the full might of the Xylan Empire was something entirely different. Commander, a young soldier named Drake, spoke up, his voice hesitant. What if we don't make it back? Lara's eyes locked on him, her expression unwavering. If we don't, then humanity stands a better chance without us, but if we do, we might just win this war. She had seen too many good people die for her to sugarcoat the truth. The odds were stacked against them, but in her heart, she knew they had to try. If they didn't, they might as well surrender now. The next day, they launched the mission under the cover of darkness, their transport ship silently cutting through the atmosphere of Valkyr. Lara stood at the front, her mind sharp as she watched the bleak, barren surface of the planet below. Valkyr was a dead world, its once thriving cities reduced to rubble by constant Xylan occupation. The remnants of civilization were barely recognizable now, nothing more than scattered ruins that spoke of years of war. The ship touched down near the edge of the Xylan fortress, hidden in a valley surrounded by jagged mountains. The team moved swiftly, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated the planet's surface. Lara led the way, her pulse rifle at the ready. Every sense was heightened. This mission could end in an explosion of violence at any moment. They reached the outer perimeter of the fortress within minutes, moving in a formation that kept them hidden from the watchful eyes of the Xylan patrols. Lara's heart was pounding, but her focus was absolute. Every breath she took, every step she made, was calculated, deliberate. Commander Harris whispered, his voice low but urgent, the communications tower is ahead. We need to disable it before the Xylans notice us. Lara nodded. We do it quick, no mistakes. They moved forward, slipping past patrols and security drones with practiced ease. The tension was palpable, but they made it to the tower undetected. Mia worked quickly, accessing the Xylan systems and hacking into their communications grid. The countdown was on. We've got 10 minutes before they notice the breach, Mia said, her fingers flying over the console. This will shut down their entire network. Lara kept watch, her eyes scanning the perimeter. She didn't trust the silence. It was too quiet, too still. But they couldn't waste any time. With a final click, Mia stood up, her face grim. It's done. Let's move. The team sprinted toward the next phase of the mission, breaking into the heart of Zorthake's fortress. But as they neared the command center, they were met with resistance. Xylan soldiers emerged from the shadows, weapons raised. It was a firefight, a brutal, chaotic exchange of gunfire and explosions. Lara's team fought valiantly, but the Xylans were prepared. They were stronger, faster, and better equipped. The odds were against them, but Lara's voice cut through the chaos, guiding her team. Push forward. She shouted, we can't stop now. They fought with everything they had, their bodies pressed against the cold metal walls of the fortress. The pain in Lara's body was nothing compared to the fire in her heart. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for everything the Xylans had taken. And she wasn't going to stop until it was over. The cold winds of Valkyr cut through Lara's jacket as she surveyed the desolate landscape ahead. Her team had successfully disabled the Xylan communications grid, but the hardest part was still ahead. They had infiltrated deep into enemy territory, but now, with the Xylan fortress looming in the distance, the true test of their resolve began. Lara's mind was sharp, but the weight of the mission pressed down on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. Commander Harris whispered, his voice low, we're close, the main entrance is just ahead. Lara nodded but didn't reply. The silence that surrounded them was deafening, broken only by the sound of their boots crunching on the hard, cracked ground. They moved in a tight formation, staying low to avoid detection from the Xylan patrols that could be lurking in the shadows. Every step was a risk, but the adrenaline that coursed through her veins kept her focused. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. The Xylan stronghold was a monolithic structure, cold, towering, and unyielding. Massive spires jutted out from the central command center, casting long shadows across the wasteland. The fortress was surrounded by a high-tech perimeter of energy shields and automated defenses, but their small team had managed to slip past undetected. For now, they were safe, but they had little time before the enemy would catch wind of their presence. "We've got maybe an hour before they realize the grid's been compromised," Mia said, her voice steady, though her dark eyes betrayed her worry. "We have to move fast." Lara turned to face her. "Then we move. No more waiting." The team pushed forward, moving through a series of narrow tunnels that led into the heart of the fortress. The air inside was thick with the scent of metal and machinery, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls. The only light came from flickering overhead panels, casting a sickly glow on their path. "I'll get the door," Mia said, already kneeling in front of a control panel. She worked quickly, her fingers flying across the console as she bypassed the security protocols. The tension was palpable as the seconds dragged on. Suddenly, the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a corridor that stretched deep into the belly of the fortress. Lara motioned for the team to move, her pulse racing as they slipped inside. The deeper they ventured into the fortress, the more the feeling of unease settled over Lara. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the distant hum of Xylan machinery made her skin crawl. There was no sign of life, no guards to challenge them, but the silence only made her more suspicious. She had led countless missions before, but there was something different about this one. It felt like a trap. "We're in," Harris said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I don't like how quiet it is." "Stay alert," Lara responded. "We haven't reached the command center yet." They passed through a series of high-tech security checkpoints, bypassing each with Mia's expert hacking skills. But with every step, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier. The fortress was a labyrinth of cold, metallic walls, and Lara's instincts told her that something was wrong. The Xylans were meticulous, calculating. They wouldn't let a small team slip past their defenses this easily. Something didn't add up. Finally, they reached a massive reinforced door that led into the inner sanctum. Beyond it lay Zorthake's command center, the heart of the Xylan Empire's operations. Mia approached the console with practiced ease, her fingers moving swiftly across the keys. "We've got company," Harris muttered, his eyes flicking to the far end of the corridor. Lara's heart skipped a beat. In the distance, she saw the flicker of movement, a group of Xylan soldiers patrolling the hall, their weapons ready. The trap had been sprung. "Move," Lara barked, and the team sprang into action. They dove into cover just as the Xylans noticed their presence. The soldiers raised their weapons, and a barrage of plasma fire lit up the corridor. The walls reverberated with the sound of gunfire as Lara's team returned fire. The resistant soldiers were trained for situations like this, but the Xylans had the upper hand in terms of technology and firepower. "Focus on the leader," Lara shouted, pointing to the Xylan officer commanding the patrol. If they took him out, the rest of the soldiers would fall into disarray. Lara's pulse rifle roared to life as she took aim, her hand steady despite the chaos around her. She squeezed the trigger, and the Xylan officer went down in a flash of blue energy. But the remaining soldiers were quick to retaliate, firing back with deadly precision. "Cover the door," Harris yelled, taking out two of the Xylans in quick succession. Mia worked feverishly at the console, her fingers moving as if she were in a race against time. The door was their only way to get to Zorthake, and they couldn't afford to waste another second. "Got it," Mia called out as the door to the command center slid open with a sharp hiss. "Let's go." Lara's team pushed forward, leaving the fallen Xylans behind as they barreled into the command center. The room was vast, filled with rows of advanced computer systems and holographic displays. The hum of the machinery was deafening, and Lara could feel the pulse of the Xylan Empire beating around her. But Zorthake was nowhere to be seen. The tension in the air was thick. They had breached the fortress, but now they were facing the unknown. Was Zorthake here, watching them from the shadows, or had they been led into a false trap? "Where is he?" Mia muttered, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the Xylan general. Lara's breath caught in her throat as she spotted a figure in the far corner of the room, partially obscured by a series of holographic maps. The tall, imposing form of Zorthake emerged from the shadows, his cold blue skin glowing under the dim light. His eyes locked onto Lara, and a chilling smile spread across his face. "You've come far, human," Zorthake's voice echoed through the room, his tone as menacing as the sound of grinding metal. "But this is where your journey ends." Lara's blood ran cold. This was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the moment she would finally face the monster responsible for her daughter's death. There would be no turning back now. "Lara, don't," Harris warned, his voice low, but Lara didn't hear him. She couldn't. All that mattered was Zorthake and the vengeance that had driven her this far. With a fierce cry, Lara charged at the Xylan general, the battle between them inevitable. "You said." The metallic door slid shut behind them with a hiss, locking Lara and her team into the heart of Zorthake's command center. The air was thick with tension, the hum of advanced technology vibrating beneath her skin. The moment she stepped into the room, her senses were overwhelmed by the sight of the Xylan general standing before them, his towering, alien figure dwarfing the space around him. Zorthake's glowing blue skin shimmered under the artificial light, his sharp eyes narrowing as they fixed on Lara. He wore an expression of calm amusement, as if he'd been expecting them. The command center around him was filled with holographic screens, each one displaying the Xylan Empire's vast network of control, war plans, and systems that spanned across the galaxy. Lara's heart raced, but her grip on her rifle remained firm. Well, the human who survived for so long," Zorthake said, his voice a cold, guttural growl. "Tell me, did you truly think you could defeat us? Did you think you could destroy what we've built?" Lara stood tall, her pulse hammering in her ears. She didn't answer him immediately. Her eyes flickered to the rest of the team, gauging their readiness. Harris, Mia, and the others had fanned out, their weapons trained on the general, but no one made a move. The tension hung in the air, thick as fog. They knew this confrontation would be the end of either them or the Xylans. "Do you think your little resistance will stand a chance?" Zorthake continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but insects, fighting a war you can never win. You're only delaying the inevitable." Lara's chest tightened. The anger she had been holding in check for so long finally broke free, a searing fire that burned through her words. "You killed my daughter," she spat, her voice filled with venom. "And for that, I will see you burn." Zorthake tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. There was no trace of emotion in his expression, just cold indifference. "You're a fool," he said softly, stepping closer, his presence like an oppressive weight in the room. "You cling to your human emotions like a crutch. It makes you weak. But it also makes you predictable." Lara's fingers tightened around the rifle's grip. "And it makes you overconfident," she replied. Without another word, she fired. The blast of the pulse rifle echoed through the command center, but Zorthake was faster. In a fluid motion, he raised one hand, and a shimmering energy shield appeared in front of him. Lara's shot struck it with a crack of energy, dissipating harmlessly against the shield. Zorthake let out a low chuckle, his voice echoing in the vast room. "Is that the best you have, human? You think your primitive weapons can stop me?" "Maybe not," Lara retorted, "but we've got something you don't." She glanced over her shoulder at Harris. At her signal, Harris opened fire, his own rifle discharging in rapid bursts. But this time, the fire wasn't aimed at Zorthake. It was aimed at the control consoles that lined the walls. Sparks flew, and a series of explosions erupted, throwing up plumes of smoke and debris. The room plunged into chaos as the systems began to flicker, their energy sources destabilizing. Zorthake snarled, his shield faltering as the consoles behind him overloaded. He extended his other hand, sending a wave of dark energy surging toward the team. The shock wave knocked Harris and Mia to the ground, their weapons slipping from their hands. Lara dove for cover, narrowly avoiding the blast. "Is that it?" Zorthake shouted over the ringing in her ears. "You think you can disrupt my empire with this pitiful attempt? You've already lost." Lara scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She needed something more. She needed to do more than just disrupt his tech, she needed to bring him down. But he was stronger, faster, and more advanced in every way. Mia pulled herself up, grimacing in pain. "We can't take him head-on," she said, panting. "We need to disable his shield." Lara nodded, her mind already working through the plan. "I'll distract him. Mia, get to the control panel. Harris, cover her." She moved without waiting for a response, pushing herself to her feet and sprinting across the room. Zorthake's eyes followed her, his smile widening. "You think you can outmaneuver me?" he sneered, raising his hand again, ready to unleash another blast of dark energy. But Lara was already ahead of him. She darted behind a pillar, narrowly avoiding the surge of power. The force of the blast left scorch marks where she'd just been standing. "Come on, Zorthake," Lara shouted, her voice filled with fury. "You're not invincible." His gaze locked onto hers, and in that moment, Lara saw something shift, an edge of frustration in his eyes. It was enough. "Mia!" Lara shouted. Mia had already begun hacking into the terminal, her fingers flying over the controls. The light on the console flickered as the system recognized her breach. Zorthake turned toward the control panel, fury flashing across his face. "No. You will not." But before he could finish, Mia hit the final command. A sudden surge of energy coursed through the control systems, sending a shockwave through the room. Zorthake's shield flickered and then collapsed, the energy field dissolving with a low hum. He let out a guttural roar of frustration, his once imposing form now vulnerable. Lara didn't hesitate. With a burst of speed, she sprinted forward, closing the distance between herself and the Xylan general. She didn't give him time to recover. As Zorthake raised his hand to strike, Lara slammed into him, knocking him off balance. The general staggered back, his momentum working against him. Before he could regain his stance, Lara jabbed her pulse rifle into his side, firing point-blank. The blast tore through his armor, leaving a smoking hole in his chest. Zorthake staggered, his eyes widening in shock. You think this will—" But his words were cut off as he crumpled to the ground, his immense form collapsing with a final, violent thud. Lara stood over him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fight was over. Zorthake, the force that had relentlessly hunted her people, was no more. But even as the realization hit her, she didn't feel the relief she expected. Instead, there was only an overwhelming emptiness, a hollow victory. She turned toward her team. Harris was pulling himself up, still winded but alive. Mia was already at the console, eyes scanning the readings. "We did it," Mia said quietly, her voice laced with disbelief. Lara didn't reply immediately. Her mind was still racing, trying to process the enormity of what had just happened. She had done it. She had avenged her daughter. But at what cost? The war wasn't over. Zorthake's death wouldn't erase the suffering of the countless lives lost. "Let's move," Lara said, her voice steady. "We've won this battle, but there's still a long war ahead." And with that, they moved forward, leaving the crumpled body of the Xylan general behind. "You said." The sky above Earth was clear, a rare sight after the years of conflict. Lara Quinn stood on the balcony of the makeshift headquarters, looking out over the city below. The scars of war were still visible, the shattered buildings, the remnants of old battlefields, but the people, the survivors, were beginning to rebuild. Slowly, but surely. Her hand rested on the railing, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The fight had been long. Too long. The world had lost so much, so many lives, so many cities, so many dreams. And yet, here she was, watching the first rays of a new day break through the horizon. The enemy was gone. The man who had torn her world apart, Zorthake, was dead. But the victory didn't feel as sweet as she had imagined. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Colonel Harris said, stepping up beside her. His voice was steady, but there was a knowing look in his eyes. He had seen the change in her. The fire that had once burned with such clarity and vengeance now seemed dimmer, more uncertain. Lara glanced at him, offering a thin smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe I've seen too many." He leaned against the railing, gazing out at the same city, a faraway look in his eyes. "Yeah, me too." For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of everything they'd lost seemed to hang in the air, thicker than the dust that still lingered from the last battle. The war was over, but the aftermath was still settling in. The wounds left by the Xylans ran deeper than the body count, deeper than the broken cities it was in their hearts. Lara turned her gaze back to the horizon, the early morning light casting a soft glow over the landscape. Zorthake's death was a momentous event, the tipping point that shattered the Xylan Empire's hold over humanity. But there was no great celebration, no cheering crowds, no victory parades. Instead, there was a somber quiet, a deep realization that while the battle was won, the war, in a sense, had only just begun. Inside the command center, things were more hectic. Mia was at one of the terminals, typing furiously as she scanned through the systems. The team had returned with the remains of their Operation Their Success, and now they had to deal with the fallout. "Lara, we've got a lot of work to do," Mia said without looking up. "The Xylans are gone, but their influence is still embedded everywhere. The infrastructure they left behind, the way they controlled everything, it's going to take years to undo it." Lara nodded. "We don't have that long." "Maybe not," Mia agreed, finally looking up. "But the people are resilient. They'll rebuild. We'll help them." "And what about us?" Lara asked, her voice almost a whisper. Mia's face softened. "We'll find our way. We always do." The room was quiet, the hum of the machinery the only sound. The fight had ended, but Lara couldn't shake the feeling that something more was waiting. The war with the Xylans had defined so much of their lives, but there was no going back to the way things were before. That night, Lara found herself in a small, quiet room in the heart of the headquarters. The walls were bare except for a single portrait of her daughter, Lila, smiling in the sunlight, her eyes filled with hope. A small table sat against the far wall, holding a framed picture of her late husband. The memories of her lost family were all around her, a silent reminder of what had been taken. She ran a hand through her hair, feeling the exhaustion of the past few days pulling at her. Her body ached, her mind felt foggy. She had spent so much time focused on vengeance, on killing the Xylans, on saving humanity. But now in the quiet aftermath, she didn't know where to go from here. She had avenged Lila. She had done what she thought was necessary, what she thought would give her peace, but now, with the war over, she was left with a question that had been gnawing at her since Zorthake fell. What comes next? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Lara," it was Harris. His voice was softer, now less rigid than usual. "Can I come in?" Lara nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He walked in, his face serious but not unkind. He took a deep breath as he looked at her, his eyes reflecting something like understanding. "You've done what you needed to do. You've led us to victory. But you can't carry it alone anymore." Lara swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do next." "You don't have to know," Harris said quietly. "No one does. But we're not fighting alone anymore. We never were." Lara sank into a chair, rubbing her face as the weight of his words settled in. "I spent so much time focused on getting back at them. On the mission. But it's over now. What's left?" "The future," Harris said simply. "The future's left." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in a long while. "I don't know how to move on from this." "You don't have to move on right away," he said, his voice steady. "But you don't have to carry it all, either. You don't have to be the only one holding this weight. We're all here. We're all in this together." Lara felt something shift in her chest. A small, tentative spark of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The war had taken everything from her daughter, her husband, her sense of self. But now, with the war over, there was the possibility of something else, rebuilding. The thought was terrifying and freeing all at once. She looked at Harris, her lips pressing into a thin line. Maybe we can rebuild. Maybe we can do something more than just fight." Harris smiled, a small, knowing smile. "That's the first step. You've led us through hell, Lara. Now, you can lead us through the recovery." Lara stood, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be hard, and the scars of war would never truly fade. But she had a new purpose now, a reason to fight that wasn't born of revenge, but of hope. "All right," she said, looking out the window again, her gaze softer now. "Let's rebuild. Let's give them something to fight for." And for the first time in years, Lara Quinn felt the flicker of hope in her chest, something that had long been buried beneath the weight of loss and anger. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living.